Hello, Eric Severy here, and welcome to a computational science video tutorial. This is the second video in my series on plotting data. Now, this is largely motivated by my students who have to plot data as a part of their final project. If you're not one of my students, that's fine. I hope you can learn something. So in my last video, we used C++ to generate our data. And we generated our data in files where everything is just one entry per line. We have an X file and a Y file for our X and Y values. Now we want to plot these as a graph because we have Y as a function of X. And we're going to plot in Python in this video. And in my next video, we're going to look at how to do it in MATLAB. All right, oops, there's the wrong way. So here we go, we're into our Python. Now we need to create a new Python file. So I'm going to come up here to New Python File, and I'm just going to call this plot my data, and it's going to generate this plot my data file. And we're going to be using a library to help us plot called matplotlib. So I'm going to import matplotlib, and in matplotlib we have a pyplot library. Oops, it's PLT. Now, if you like the editor I'm using, I do use a program called PyCharm when I'm using Python, and it's made by the same people who created CLion. It's a great editor for Python. It has debugging and features like that. I highly recommend you give it a try. Any editor will work. You just need to type these lines into a text file, and then you can run it from the command line. PyCharm will run everything for us, and it makes life easier. I think there's a program called Idle on Windows, but PyCharm works on all operating systems, so I use it. All right, so what we want to do is we want to open up some files, read the data from the files, and then plot them. So I'm going to look back at my C++ code, and in my C++ code, when I write my files, I create these variables for the path and the file name. So I'm going to copy these variables in C++, and I'm going to paste them in Python. For some reason, we got a new line here. I'm not really sure why. It would actually make my life easier if I just kept them there. Now in Python, we don't have data types. We don't worry about the types in Python. So here, where my variable name is path, I can ignore everything before that. Here the variable name is X file. I'm going to ignore the type before it, and Y file, ignore the type before it. The other thing we can ignore, we don't have semicolons at the end of our lines in Python, so we're going to make those go away also. All right, now everything is set up exactly the way we want. These variables should work just fine in Python. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to open these files. So I'm just going to call this file, we're going to use it for a short time, it's going to be called XF. That's just another way to write X file. I should maybe have X file name. So XF is equal to open X file. And this is just going to open, it's going to basically create a file and open it up. And that's going to be XF. Then I'm going to create Y file, and that's going to equal open Y file. All right, now we're going to read from the data, and I'm just going to say X equals XF.read, Y equals YF.read, XF.close. Just like in C++, it's a good idea to close your files when you're done. So here I'm going to close my files in Python. And when we read it, we're really copying all the data from the file into the variable X and all the data into the variable Y. Now the problem here is the data in X and Y is string. It's a string of characters. And what we want to do is we want to convert it from a string to numeric data that we can plot. And for this numeric data, or for this conversion from string to numeric, I'm going to use what I think is a really interesting line of code, and it might be a little complicated if you've never used Python before, so I'm going to explain it a bit more. So in general, if we weren't going to use the short line, I would have to create an array for X, so this is going to be my X array, and I would have to define it as an empty array. And then I would want to say, well, for every element in X, but X is text, so I need to split my text. Now to do a for loop, we do a colon at the end, and we flip like this. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the string, and every time we have white space in our string X, we're going to split. and it's going to be put, and we're going to go through every element that's been split up, and that element's going to be named E. And what we would want to do is we want to take our X array and append the variable E. But E is a string, so we need to convert to a float. Now in Python, they don't differentiate between float and double, so we're just going to use float. If you try to use double, you'll get an error. In C++, they're a little bit more specific about those things. Now these 3 lines of code, using kind of the old, like, you know, they can be simplified. And we can simply say, well, X, I'm just going to overwrite my variable X, and I'm going to redefine a new X based on the old X. So even though the old X is a string, I can create a numeric thing X, and we can change it. And I'm just going to say float E. So notice how basically this thing that I'm appending to my array is what we're going to have here, float E. But in this line of code, we have to say what is E. So I'm going to say float E for E in x.split. So it's kind of a weird line of code coming from C++. So it's going to actually really start at the end. It's going to read backwards. It's going to take X, it's going to split it up into an array of strings, and for every one of those strings, based on it being split on white spaces, every string E is going to be converted to a float, and that's how we're going to populate our array. So we can really have this pretty simple line of code. Once you get used to it, it gets very natural. We can change it for Y, just change it in 2 places. And we very quickly have made our arrays X and Y in just 2 lines of code. And I think once you're used to this format, it's pretty easy to read. All right, so we have our X and Y arrays. Now we need to use our plot function. So we imported matplotlib as plt. So to access matplotlib functions, we're going to type plt dot the function we want to use. So I'm just going to plot xy, and this is going to generate an xy plot. But if we want to run or show this plot, we need to show it. So we have to do plt dot show. Usually when I make a mistake with matplotlib, I forget this line. And the reason we show it is we can do a bunch of modifications with our plot here, and then when we're finally ready to show it, we show it. All right, we can run our data now. So if we right click here, we can go down to run, plot my data. After we do that the first time, we can just click on the arrow up there. We go to my home screen. Oh, and my background just changed. And here you can see our plot, and we plotted the sine function that we had computed here. So this should be the sine of x from 0 to 10. Now if you're looking at this, you're like, oh, I want this to have a higher resolution. That's fine. We can jump in and we can change our C program to be 201 linearly spaced points. We can then run our C++ program again, and it will generate our data. Once our C++ program is finished running, then we can go back to our Python program and we can see a much more smooth curve to look at. So if we jump in here now with Python, Python will run using the new data, and you can see our data is a lot more smoothly created. All right, so that's just kind of what I want to point out here for Python. I think it's a pretty nice way to work with our data. And, you know, it allows us to make changes to our C++, very quickly jump to Python, re-visualize our data, and this is a way for us to check our work. You know, we can look at the graph and we can quickly tell, are all the values where they need to be? Are the variables behaving the way we want? And I think this isn't too bad. You know, really in 20 lines of code, I'm able to create my paths and my file names, read everything in, close my files, create it to an array, and then plot it. All right, thank you for watching. If you found this video useful, please give me a like. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments below. If you have any suggestions for future videos, I'd appreciate to hear those in the comments. Otherwise, just keep on coding.